Good morning, Trinidad and Tobago. This morning I'm joined for a weekly midweek press conference to deal with critical and alarming matters in the public space by MP Anita Haynes. This week I know many of you, citizens of our great republic, would have been engaged in several activities of a religious nature, this week being Holy Week. Our Christian brothers and sisters are today observing Holy Thursday. Our Hindu brothers and sisters yesterday observed Hanuman Jayanti. And our Muslim brothers and sisters are engaged in the holy month of Ramadan. Anita, I think the only thing the government has not said, as every sector has collapsed, is Jesus take the wheel. And over the next few days, in local parlance, we often say things are getting bad. I think we have to stop saying in Trinidad and Tobago that things are getting bad, because things are not getting bad, it is bad. And as part of the responsible and loyal opposition, both Anita and I will be addressing critical matters that have been quite alarming in the national space over the past couple of days in terms of the education sector, the public utility sector, and the sector that affects the rights, freedoms, liberties, and protection of our nation's children. So this morning, before I go into my areas that I shadow, I would like to pass you over to MP Anita Haynes, the Member of Parliament for Tabakit.
Thank you, Barry. Good morning to all of our viewers. Barry, you are very correct in your introduction. Trinidad and Tobago has been in dire straits for quite some time. Before I begin my presentation this morning, I would like to deliver some context. Oftentimes we come here, we do our weekly pressers, sometimes midweek and on Sundays, and we bring forth to the information to the public what has been happening, the details in our various shadow portfolios or under our various shadow portfolios. And people sometimes forget how long we would have been carrying a particular issue. So this week, we were faced with a major headline. That headline told us some 2,800 students dropped out of primary and secondary schools across Trinidad and Tobago between 2020 and 2022. That has led to many talking points, a number of issues, and it has also led to complete silence coming from the Minister of Education. But before I go into the details of the information we have coming to hand now, I would like to show a clip from Parliament during our parliamentary question time. And we're discussing the same issue, whether or not students are able, at this time we're discussing access to online classes. And so if we play the clip, and I'll go into the details after. Who have dropped out. So I'm asking specifically, given that information came to the public domain within the last 2 months, has there been any additional plans or programs put into place given the data that we currently have today?
Minister of Education. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I am not sure of the veracity or the context of what the member has quoted in terms of figures, but I am certain that students who are not present on the online environment, who have access to the virtual environment, they are contacted through their teachers, by their parents, through the social services division to ensure that if any issues arise with their attendance, that is sorted out to the best of the ability of the teachers and the school social workers and guidance counselors. Supplemental member Flauki.
Student support services, given that they would bear a significant responsibility in terms of keeping students within individual school system.
Minister of Education. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The school social workers have been trained to deliver online, and they have also been in contact with students face to face, so that there is no gap in the delivery of their services, so that if there are students experiencing difficulty, they are able to intervene whether online or face to face as necessary.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we showed that clip from Parliament, and that is before the reopening of the physical school system. At that time, the information coming into the public domain was that there were some 46,770 students who never accessed the online system. This is not a couple hundred. This is not a few students, a few isolated incidents. This was coming to the Parliament via a Joint Select Committee that there were 46,770 students who never, not one day, accessed the online system. That did not take into account the students who may have accessed once or twice, who may have been inconsistent with their access to the online system, who may be online but not participating, who may have been online but unable to cope with the online system, so that the environment that they were in, whether they were using phones, whether they had shoddy internet services, none of these things were considered. This 46,770 students that I tried to bring to the attention to the Minister of Education in Parliament. And I played the clip so persons, so the citizens, members of the general public of Trinidad and Tobago can see how when serious issues fundamental to our education sector are brought for clarification, for accountability, for transparency, using the vehicle that we have that facilitates or ought to facilitate this sort of thing, the Parliament, how it is treated with. The minister, instead of answering the question, instead of at the time using her space as the Minister of Education, the person with overall oversight over our education sector, to acknowledge that there was and there remains a serious problem with children not staying within the school system during and now post-pandemic, the minister sought to question the veracity of my data. And so I asked this morning, the information coming from the Ministry of Education is that there are 2,800 students who completely dropped out. That's the information, that's the data coming from them. Now you have to stand by the veracity of your data, and you have to disaggregate that data. And that data was obtained via a Freedom of Information application. And so what we've asked it in Parliament, and again, it was met with arrogance, it was met with dismissal. Instead of a solution-oriented approach, there is a constant space, a pushback to pretend that there is no issue, that there is no problem. And so if we know now, according to the ministry, that 2,800 students dropped out of primary and secondary schools across Trinidad and Tobago, it shows us that the ministry has failed our vulnerable students. If in 2021 you knew that there were students who were at the very least at that time 1 year behind because they were never accessing online system, if you knew that by 2022 you were still trying to get hardware, laptops into the hands of students who would have been in an online system since 2020, you already knew there were going to be gaps. You already knew we were facing a very serious issue. And if in 2023 now, all that you can give to the public is that these students have dropped out and no additional information. No information as to what the support services are. No information, no data as to what led to the dropout. No disaggregated data across school districts. It shows a lazy and incompetent approach to policy making. Because I can tell you, in 2022, at the budget debate, raising these same issues, we were going back into a physical school system. We had rampant issues with school infrastructure, so bad that concrete blocks were falling on students. After 2 years of having these schools closed, instead of using that time to upgrade the physical infrastructure of the schools so that they could be prepared for an eventual reopening, they did nothing. So you had problems with food infrastructure, with school infrastructure. You had the high cost of back to school. Let us put everything into context. During our lockdown periods, many persons were out of a job. Many persons have not gotten back to their pre-pandemic space. We had an increase in fuel cost. We had a rise in overall transportation cost. We had the collapse of the school transportation system, so that the actual physical getting to school, getting your child from your home to school, the cost had increased exponentially. I said to the minister then, what are you doing to help vulnerable families? In 2022 and now in 2023, Trinidad has gotten to a space where some families have to decide with their limited income or no income at all, their limited resources, which child from their children they can put their hopes for success in. Barry, you would know that is an old-time way of thinking, that only one may get out and carry the rest of the family forward. So this idea of free access to free education, and so that means we all have the same opportunities, shows exactly how out of touch with reality this government is. That you have families in areas in Tabaquite and Princetown who are spending upwards of $70 a day in transportation costs, because to come out of a rural community, because of road infrastructure collapse, you have to walk out the road. When you get to the main road, the taxi is telling you they're not coming in there unless you pay $10, $15, $20 extra. Then you have to take another taxi, and that is the way you're getting to school. When we ask about school transportation, the minister tells us it is all working. When we are in our communities, and I can tell you that there was no school transportation put in place for parts of the Tabaquite constituency, that they are doing things without allowing data to drive the purpose. And so now when we look at 2,800 students who dropped out of school, we know no answers are forthcoming. We know no solutions are forthcoming, because the ministry has not been able to correct a single problem facing our education sector. And they're all interconnected. From school dropout rates to examination pass rates, which we all saw what happened last year at the C and CSEC levels, that students were unable to make the pass mark. This again goes into what happened during COVID, what happened with our learning loss, and the complete absence of targeted policies from the ministry to correct the measures before. So instead we get a reactionary approach, and a reactionary approach that's not even tested, that hasn't even been through the rigors of any proper monitoring and evaluation, so that you can say, yes, this is working or this isn't working, and we can keep certain parts. We also have the issues with school violence, again, interconnected. If you had students, I want you to keep that 46,770 number in your mind. If you had these students never accessing online school, some of them coming back into the system, and some of them, as we are clearly seeing now, not coming into the system at all, you are talking about 2+ years of learning loss. When you get back into school, you are asking teachers who you have treated with scant regard, that you have looked at the teachers and said, you are deserving of nothing, not even proper negotiations with respect to your salary. That you have told teachers that the people who kept the online school system going over the pandemic years, who transitioned from physical to online and then back to physical school, who kept the system going. And you heard the response from the Minister of Education, that the people who are charged with the responsibility of keeping students in schools are the teachers. With what resources? In what way? How is the ministry of, how are teachers meant to carry out a mandate that lies clearly within the remit of the Ministry of Education? How are teachers expected to keep students in school when the Ministry of Social Development and the Ministry of Education completely washes its hands of any kind of targeted intervention? And so I say to Trinidad and Tobago, when we see these alarming headlines, when we see startling numbers, understand it is a process for us to get here. It is one level of incompetence after another. It is a 2015 to 2020 administration that took laptops out of the hands of students and said there was no need. That when we got to the pandemic by 2019, you had a panic because you had no devices for students. It took you 2 years to get devices into the hands of the students, and then you were unable to get the system right. In that 2 years, you pretended nothing was going wrong, and now we know. Now we're seeing, by way of the examination results, by way of the rampant school violence, by way of the student dropout numbers that we are seeing, that the problem is indeed bigger than this PNM administration can handle. Because their absolute resolve now has been silenced. Since these numbers, there's been silence by the ministry. Today, there's supposed to be a post-cabinet briefing. We should see if the minister will intervene and give us any more details. But the facts are, right now, they have failed the children of Trinidad and Tobago. Turn over to you, Barry.
Thank you, Anita, for that very comprehensive. I know it's an issue that you have been following for a good few months, particularly in light of the interest of the children of Trinidad and Tobago being at stake. I want to raise this morning two very critical and disturbing developments in the national space over the past few days. First, a matter that the Trinidad Express exposed, but it is also a matter that we in the UNC have been following through the Chief Whip, David Lee, who shadows the area of energy and energy industries. And I want to turn your attention to a headline in the Business Express yesterday that says, how government slow action could cost taxpayers almost $1 billion. I want to slightly amend that, because it really should have read how government incompetence would cost taxpayers almost $1 billion. This expose done by the Trinidad Express and the Business Express, I want to share some of the content with you to put it into perspective. Curtis Williams writes, government's delay of more than 3 years will lead to taxpayers forking out hundreds of millions of dollars in higher electricity rates from the BP Shell solar power project, according to multiple sources familiar with the issue. The Express business has been able to confirm that when the consortium of BP, TT, and Shell approached the government with the renewable energy project, the cost to the administration would have been, and listen to this part carefully, 4.02 US cents per kilowatt hour. However, by the time the deal was eventually linked late last year, it had skyrocketed to 6.745 US cents per kilowatt hour. That is a massive 61% increase in the price. Now, this started off as a pilot project in simple terms for something that we are all familiar with, and that is the use of renewable energy through solar paneling. The article goes on to say, at the original price, the country would have been paying the consortium US 11.6 million a year, but at the revised price, Trinidad and Tobago would have to fork out US 18.8 million per annum, a US 7.2 or over US 140 million during the 20-year life of the project. This is close to 1 billion Trinidad and Tobago dollars. The article says, more than that, it effectively meant that we have agreed to pay for renewable energy more per kilowatt than we are at present paying to the independent power producers of 4.7 US cents per kilowatt hour. The news also comes as the Trinidad and Tobago Electricity Company has asked the Regulated Industries Commission to grant it an increase in electricity rates, which has been the source of so much public outcry and controversy. I will stick a pin there, because for many of you, in the national community, in the national space, we in the opposition have been fighting the fight with respect to the increased rates that are to come with respect to electricity in Trinidad and Tobago. Our representatives, Anita sits next to me, and Anita has been present at many of these consultations fighting for her constituents. We have only seen UNC representatives, and it is no secret. The media has been reporting that the UNC representatives have been present through the length and breadth of this country, making contributions, supporting business comments, the business community, the chambers of commerce, civil society groups, and citizens across the board who have a serious problem with being told that against a backdrop of high crime, high inflation, high food prices, and a country that is in total collapse, that they are unable to pay these additional electricity rates. Now we are seeing why. It's often said that the devil is in the details, and the reason why I am at pains this morning to share this Trinidad and Tobago Express expose about this pilot project is so that you understand why the government is picking your pockets by putting additional burdens on you, the consumer, to pay higher electricity rates. And I'm calling on the RIC this morning to wake up from your slumber, because we are on to you, and we are on to the PNM and its government, especially with respect to this development. I want to share with you, it says, in a joint response to questions from Express Business, the company said both BP and Shell, as owners of the solar project, have been progressing the development of the project closely with all relevant stakeholders, including the Trinidad and Tobago Electricity Commission. Pricing and cost details are confidential and cannot be disclosed. I'll deal with that in a moment. The companies were asked the following questions last week by the Trinidad Express. Can BP say whether the delay in the startup of Project Lara, that's the name of the project, led to an increase in cost and therefore an increase in the price Trinidad and Tobago Electricity Company will be paying per kilowatt hour of power? If so, can you say if the increase in excess of 60%? What would have led to the increase in the prices being paid? How did the insistence on a power generation license impact the project? The companies insisted that they continue to work with the government in an effort to get construction off the ground. Well, BP, well, Shell, we will share some news with you this morning. While you continue to liaise with the government to get the project off the ground, nothing has happened. Zero, zilch, nada, absolutely nothing has happened from then to now with respect to this project. BP and Shell, as a project owner for the solar project, continue to work collaboratively with the government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, supporting their intent to develop power generation. They added, since the announcement of financial investment decision in December 2022, the project owners continue to work closely with the government and third parties, etc. This is now a timeline of how we arrived at the announcement of this project to where we are as of today. February 2018, the government of Trinidad and Tobago signed the United Nations Paris Agreement ratification in New York. March 2018, the government, with much fanfare, launched expression of interest. November 2018, Government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago launched the RFP documentation. July 2019, the RFP submission deadline. March 2020, consortium award preferred bidder status. It estimated 2021 to begin construction with 2022 commercially operational renewable energy projects. This is where it gets very interesting in this article. It says, however, in 2020, former Energy Minister Franklin Kahn died, and the Energy Ministry was handed over to Stuart Young. From the death of Kahn, it appeared that the timeline simply slipped, and to date, there is still no construction of the project. It further says, it is a licensing system that delayed the project by almost a year, which has led to significant challenges in even installing solar panels on homes. Now, this In local parlance, we say it adds insult to injury, because the licensing system that delayed the project, the licensing comes from the Ministry of Public Utilities and Tech. Compounded with that situation was the passing of Minister Franklin Khan, and taking over the portfolio was Minister Stuart Young. And I want to share and to connect the dots for citizens with respect to something that was asked by the Chief Whip in the Parliament on January 23rd, 2023. And David Lee asks the Honourable Minister of Energy and Energy Affairs, will the Minister state whether any changes have been made to the terms and conditions of the bid that was issued in 2020 for the construction of a 112 megawatts solar photovoltaic project won by the joint consortium of BP, Shell and Lightsource BP? Answering for the Minister of Energy, Minister Camille Robinson-Raggie stood up and she had this to say, and this can be found on the Hansard. The Minister said, there have been no changes to the terms and conditions on which bids were evaluated for the supply of electricity generation from renewable energy resources, wind and or solar PV, of up to 130 megawatts to the national grid on a build, own and operate basis, and to the bid which was won by the consortium comprising Lighthouse Renewable Global Development Limited and also called Lightsource BP, Shell Trinidad and Tobago Limited and BP Alternative Energy Trinidad and Tobago Limited. The Minister, Camille Robinson-Raggie, went on to say, however, it should be noted that the global pricing environment for materials, in particular materials that attributable to renewables, has changed over the 2-year period between acceptance of the bid and the finalization of the agreements with the government of Trinidad and Tobago. As a result, during the negotiation period, appropriate cost variations were negotiated and agreed to. It was MP Tanku in a supplemental then asked the Minister, Minister, I was wondering whether the Minister could confirm that the increase in the cost that you referred to is based solely as a result of the increased construction input cost. Can you confirm that it is based solely on the construction input? Minister Camille Robinson-Raggie, is answering for the Minister of Energy, said, as I said in my response initially, the change in cost was based on materials, and in particular materials attributable to renewables, which has changed over the last 2 years. What we see happening coming out of this expose and the questions that the opposition has been asking on this pilot project with respect to renewable energies, we have ascertained 2 main reasons for why this project has not gotten off the ground. Based on the confession of Minister Camille Robinson-Raggie, the Minister is saying that negotiations had to be re-engaged. But we are also hearing that it has to do specifically with the failure of the Ministry of Public Utilities. And Anita told you about the incompetence in education. And sometimes I often wonder is whether ministers do not speak to themselves. What do they do in those cabinet meetings? Because if the Minister of Energy is not speaking to the Minister of Public Utilities, whose purview through TNTech is to review these licensings and this licensing system to get the project up and running, then what exactly is going on? The Minister of Energy and Energy Industries likes to posture himself in the public domain as second in command with respect to negotiations. He sells the Prime Minister as the best salesman in the world. We have seen the effects with respect to gas prices in this country, where they went to Houston. Nobody knows what was the arrangements, the nature of the discussions, etc., with respect to fixing those gas prices. But later down the road, we felt the repercussions of not taking technocrats, of not seeking advice, but by taking unilateral decisions by the Prime Minister to negotiate gas prices. And then when the prices started to affect Trinidad and Tobago in a very negative way, the same Minister of Energy ran out to say, well, no, we didn't do any of that. So it is almost as though today is today and yesterday is yesterday when it is convenient to this minister and this government. You cannot get a greater example of incompetence when we are told that a minister passed away, another minister takes up the office, and because there is an interval between that time, that the project really was stymied because of that. That to me is an unacceptable response to the situation that we are now being told will cost taxpayers $1 billion. The government continues to hide behind non-disclosure agreements, and BP and Shell told us, that because of the arrangements between the government and the company, that the non-disclosure agreements prevents them from saying whether or not the price increases from 4.2 US cents per kilowatt to 6.7 US cents per kilowatt is purely because of an increase in materials. And between that 2 years, in terms of the increase of materials, when the project was supposed to start, to where we are as of now, whose fault is that the government delayed the project and materials increased? Is it its taxpayers' fault? No, it is the incompetence of the government. But who has now to pay that price? Who will pay the $1 billion in terms of the increase for this project? And the answer is simple. It is not Prime Minister Keith Rowley. It is not Minister Stuart Young. It is the taxpayers' dollars that will pay the $1 billion increase in price to BP and Shell for this project. And I'm saying this morning that the government cannot continue to remain silent on this issue. We will use whatever legal methods there are through freedom of information requests, through questions in the parliament, to keep this issue alive, because the RIC is engaged in a rate review at this point. And what will happen is the RIC being the puppets of the government. And we have seen how the RIC has operated in a very underhand way through the consultations by stymieing and suppressing the voices of civil society, the opposition and others, to let the government have its way. And I'm sounding the warning to both the government and the RIC. We will use whatever legal methods we have available to us to get answers to the pertinent questions. And this morning, I'm calling on the RIC to take note of this development. Citizens cannot be paying for government's incompetence of over $1 billion, and the RIC will just sit down, put their fingers on their lips and say thank you. I want to remind the country that the situation that we are in today with respect to the take-or-pay arrangement with independent power producers that was signed off on in 2009, because at that time a PNM government wanted to bring on these alcohol smelter plants. And that excess power that is on the grid today is a financial burden that the people of Trinidad and Tobago is still paying, because we cannot get out of those arrangements. Those arrangements have not been reviewed. And therefore, a similar situation is developing with this Lara project. And I really hope that this has nothing, that the name Lara project really has nothing to do with Brian Lara. That I hope that is not where they got the name. Because we already had, Anita, the Brian Lara Stadium scandal of close to $2 billion. And today, history is repeating itself with a scandalous situation. And as I said, the Express needs to amend their headline. This shouldn't read how government slow action could cost taxpayers almost $1 billion. It should have read how government slow action would cost taxpayers almost $1 billion. Both BP and Shell, speaking with the Trinidad Express, together with Minister Camille Robbins-Ureji's having addressed this matter through a question raised by Chief Whip David Lee in the Parliament. They have confirmed that what the Express is saying is correct in terms of the negotiations. They have renegotiated prices and so on. The prices that were negotiated 3 years ago is not what we will be paying now. And the bottom line, the question that must be asked is, who will be held responsible? Because it is the taxpayers that will have to pay this, and the RIC must break their silence on this scandalous development. This is a dereliction of duty, of Tweedledee and Tweedledum, the Prime Minister and Minister Stuart Young. And therefore they cannot remain silent on this issue. Another matter that I would like to turn your attention to has to do with the developments that we saw occurring in the sphere of the protection of our nation's children. And I want to start off by saying, Ayanna Webster Roy must go. Full stop. Full stop. Ayanna Webster Roy must go. She must be fired. Full stop. I said earlier this week that the issues facing the sector requires someone with commitment, drive, passion, and a sense of urgency to treat with these matters. Ayanna Webster Roy in 8 years has proven that she is not that person. I want to remind the national community that when the Justice Judith Jones report came out almost 1 year ago, Anita, we just passed the 1 year mark from when the government received the Justice Judith Jones report about child abuse in our nation's institutions that is responsible for the protection, the welfare, and the housing of our nation's children. The government, in April of 2022, 1 year ago, they set the date for the proclamation of the licensing regime. Now, one of the recommendations coming out of the Justice Judith Jones report was that all institutions, all these children's homes must meet the licensing regime criteria that is enshrined in law under the Children Community Residences and Nursery Act. At the end of April, the Minister of Gender and Child Affairs announced that the government was setting up a task force to come up with a work plan. That was alarming in itself, because it told us that work wasn't starting right away, that they needed time to come up with a work plan. This was at the end of April 2022. They got the report in March, thereabout. On June 25th, 2022, answering a question in the Senate to the Prime Minister, Acting Leader of Government Business Paula Gopi-Skoon said, and I quote, that March 31st, 2023 was sufficient and ample time to get the homes ready. This is a senior government minister, a member of the Cabinet of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, giving the assurance, comforting, after much outrage about the abuse at these children's homes, gave the assurance to the national community that March 31st, 2023 was sufficient and ample time to get the homes ready. Now, we have seen a highly irresponsible minister in the person of Ayanna Webster Roy. And I will say this, Anita, the media, particularly the Trinidad Guardian, has propped this Minister of Gender and Child Affairs with back-to-back front pages crying crocodile tears about what was happening at our nation's homes. But for 8 years almost, this minister has been in this position. These issues were not new. And therefore, one would have expected that this minister would have treated with this issue with a sense of urgency. But instead, in particular, the Trinidad Guardian chose to stifle the voices of civil society and the opposition because they were only carrying Minister Ayanna Webster Roy on their front pages, crying about what was happening, that she was so saddened by the situation. Fast forward, 1 year later, the 13 homes that remain unlicensed, they are now being given an extension of July 1st, 2023. What do you expect will happen come July 1st, 2023, when a minister who has been in office for almost 8 years has done absolutely nothing? And I'll share this with you. That minister, Ayanna Webster Roy, is on record. It is on the Hansard. I think it is on the social media. Everybody has seen it. Where on every occasion, the issue of the understaffing and under-resourcing of the Children's Authority has been denied by the minister, Ayanna Webster Roy. That is the same minister, when the Sea Bridge collapsed, stood up in the parliament in response to Mrs. Kamala Bissar-Bissessa, and she said, get it right, nobody is suffering, people in Tobago are not suffering, when there was no groceries on the shelves in Tobago. That is the same minister, Ayanna Webster Roy, who continues to live in denial today, heading the protection and welfare of our nation's children. The minister stood a few days ago after being smoked out by the opposition and the media. She came out from hiding with a group of technocrats to say that the government will now extend the date of proclamation to July 1st, 2023 for the remaining 13 homes that remain unlicensed. The minister then went to give a breakdown of the percentage of work that has been completed. And therefore, it gave us an idea of what needed to be done in order for these 13 homes to meet the criteria. I want to ask first today, Minister, having been there for 8 years, you missed your own deadline. The people of Trinidad and Tobago didn't set the deadline of March 31st, 2023. You and your government set that deadline. You have failed the citizens and the children by not meeting that deadline. The question that you must answer is, what then happens come July 1st? Because based on your prior experience, we cannot take your word for any value. What will happen on July 1st, 2023, when many of these homes are not licensed? And I'll tell you why I have no faith that these homes will not be licensed come July 1st, 2023. The minister indicated that several of these homes were still trying to get fit for purpose in terms of the physical arrangements. And there must be, and Anita, you know it, you worked in the office of the Prime Minister along with me, that there's a monitoring and evaluation unit, because the Gender and Child Affairs falls under the office of the Prime Minister. Not a word from the minister in terms of what mechanisms, what specific deliverables, measurable deliverables are there in a specified unit to monitor the progress of these homes in terms of the physical arrangements. That's one. But it is not just the physical arrangements. There must be psychological and psychometric testing, safety and security evaluation that is constantly being done every quarter to ensure that you meet the licensing requirements. Not a word from the minister on those specific issues. Just a blanket statement with more crocodile tears and very little specifics. I want to remind this country that I raised in the Standing Finance Committee in October 2022 that the Children's Authority came to me as a shadow minister with responsibility for gender and child affairs, and they indicated that they gave the minister a budget for the Children's Authority of $180 million. They told the minister that that is what will be needed to address the challenges in the next financial year, 2022-2023. The minister, and it is on the Hansard, the minister stood up in the parliament when I raised this. And I said, Minister, is this true? The minister's response was, well, they cannot get everything that they want. They got less than half of what they asked for. And therefore, are you surprised, Minister, while you continue to drag your feet in the protection of our nation's children, are you surprised that these homes are still unable to meet the licensing requirements when you are underfunding them? The minister in that press conference is yet to answer whether or not the homes are receiving their funding so that they are able to reach the licensing requirements in terms of the physical arrangements, whether or not they have been receiving their funding. Because we are told that if the Children's Authority as the umbrella body is being staffed, that the children's homes themselves are not receiving the money so that they can get the work done. And that is a critical area that the minister has not addressed. All the minister says is every time she goes to the Minister of Finance, that the Minister of Finance helps. But if the funding is being stymied along the process, obviously they don't have the money to put the physical arrangements in place, and construction will be delayed. And that is exactly what is happening. But that is not the only issue that has the children's homes in the position that they are in today. Because these homes, according to law, are illegally operated. And you are leaving, what is the end result? You are leaving hundreds of children at the mercy of abusers, at the mercy of a broken system, at the mercy of poor sanitation and poor conditions. I want to ask the Honourable Minister, the Executive Director of the Children's Authority is on record on February 15, 2023, when she said that the Children's Authority requires 942 persons for them to operate at their maximum capacity. When asked, out of that 942 persons, how many do you have? The Director of the Children's Authority said they had a complement of 236. That is sad, it is pathetic for a minister who has been there for almost 8 years. And that is why we say this morning, Ayanna Webster Roy and this entire government, they came and they cried crocodile tears telling us about SABGA report and so on. And they abused us in the most vile way. And when we put on the public record that SABGA report was in the public domain, they started to backtrack. But today, a report coming out from Justice Judith Jones that was commissioned by this government, absolutely nothing has been done to protect our nation's children. And therefore, with 236 staff members at the Children's Authority, out of a total of 942 that is needed, the Minister of Gender and Child Affairs, again, you would recall, Anita, that they sometimes come for variations and supplementation, meaning mid-year review, and just now we'll have another mid-year review. In June of 2021, they came and they asked for $23 million for the Children's Authority. And during the Standing Finance Committee, I again asked the Minister, what would this $23 million additional that you are asking for outside of the budget? This $23 million additional, what would this be used for? The minister on the Hansard said, when I asked, I said, is this to pay staff or will it be used to bring in new staff, specialized staff, behavioral psychologists, persons who can do the psychometric evaluation and testing? Would that be used for that? The minister told me 70% of the allocation would be used for that. Today, the director of the Children's Authority is telling us that out of a complement of 942, 236 are present. This is a worrying situation, but it is a situation that has developed because the stakeholders who are entrusted with the protection of our nation's children. They are propping a failed, broken system and a minister who has demonstrated that she is at sea, she is clueless, she is helpless, and she does not know what to do. The TTPS also has questions to answer. The minister came and the minister spoke with the permanent secretary saying that the abusers of the homes are no longer there and some have died and so on, without giving any empirical data, statistics. One reporter from one of the daily newspapers told me that he contacted the TTPS through the communications unit. I had my office contact the TTPS communications unit asking for data in light of what the permanent secretary in the Division of Gender and Child Affairs has put into the public domain, that the alleged abusers have died and they are no longer there. That is unacceptable for a permanent secretary to just make a blanket statement without giving the empirical evidence and data. And therefore, the onus this morning is on the TTPS to say, out of the Justice Judith Jones report, how many persons named in that report were investigated? How many persons were charged? How many persons have passed? How many investigations are still ongoing? What is the status of those investigations? So while the Commissioner of Police, I'm sure, might be engaged in a lot of prayers over this weekend, we hope that her office would respond to these burning questions, because it is the responsibility of all of us collectively to protect our nation's children. And right now, it is evident that a lot of the stakeholders are falling down on the job, because the evidence available to us demonstrates that our children continue to be in an environment where they are not being protected, where their interest is not being sought. I want to ask also, as I wrap up, what has happened to the other recommendations coming out of the Justice Judith Jones report? When the report came out, Anita, you know it, Mrs. Pasabi says, and myself, those of us who raise children's issues based on education. I raise children's issues based on the Children's Authority. We asked, we said that they are low-hanging fruit, that instantly you can implement. One of those things was the Children's Ombudsman. What has become of that? What has become of the National Commission on Children's Rights? What has become, and this was a recommendation that we made, in the Foreign Ministry they have an inspector of missions, where that person travels and they inspect the embassies and so on. We said you must set up a unit that is purely responsible for quarterly inspections of children's homes unannounced. And therefore you take a sample of the children who go to that home, who live in the homes, and you get an idea from them what are the conditions in the home, and so you do the psychometric evaluation and so on. What has happened to that recommendation? I saw one editorial, I believe it was the Express, in an attempt to really chastise the minister and the government about the current situation of moving the proclamation date from March 31st to June 1st and the poor management of the entire sector that deals with the rights and protections of children. I saw that the Trinidad Express in an editorial lumped successive administrations, meaning the UNC, as partly to blame. I want to remind Trinidad and Tobago, the Trinidad Express this morning, that between 2001 to 2010, there was no Children's Authority in this country, even though the legislation was on our statute books. It took a People's Partnership Prime Minister Kamla Pasabi-Sessa to review the legislation from 2010 to 2014, and then through Stephanie Daly as our first chairman of the Children's Authority, to put that Children's Authority into effect, to ensure all the arms were operating, that the legislation was workable. It was not perfect. We knew that the amendments would have to be made. But you cannot blame the UNC, the People's Partnership, Kamala Prasad-Bissessa, and the opposition UNC today, when we are the ones who are responsible. It's almost funny, if not tragic, that we were the ones responsible for putting legislation that was 10 years old into effect when we came into office. Legislation that was allowed to languish under People's National Movement government for 10 years. And you want to put in an editorial that we are partly responsible and we must take blame for that too? We will take no blame for that, because we have been at the forefront in the protection of children and children's rights in this country. So when the fourth estate wants to go after the PNM for their incompetence, their slothfulness, their laziness with Ayanna Webster Roy and this government, you must appropriate blame where it must be, and don't try to pad it by throwing the UNC into the mix. That is one blame we will not take, because we have been at the forefront of protecting our nation's children in this country. Some of the things that we did, we were the ones who built the safe houses. We were the ones who completed the legislative review. We established the Children's Authority, put Stephanie Daly as the chairman to make the authority workable. Since then to now, absolutely little or nothing has happened in this sector. So this morning, I know it was two lengthy issues that I had to deal with, but I felt it necessary for the opposition to respond. Because the first issue with respect to what is happening with this ALARA project through the Trinidad and Tobago Express expose, and the questions raised by the Chief Whip David Lee, and the issues we've been raising on this matter, would now mean that the delay in this project of $1 billion in cost to TNTech will be passed on to the consumer. And the RIC must take note of this, and the RIC must make a statement and call on the government for a copy of the arrangements, the terms and conditions that were signed between the government and BP and Shell. And now the ball is in the court of the RIC, but I assure the RIC that as long as we have breath in our lives as members of the responsible and loyal opposition, we will fight you tooth and nail so that citizens will not have to pay this $1 billion of incompetence by this government. Keith Rowley, Twiddledee and Twiddledum, Keith Rowley and Minister of Energy, Stuart Young. So we are calling on them to answer the questions that is in the public domain, both in the spheres, in the spheres of education, I can't make this mistake at all. MP Anita Haynes, myself, MP Barry Padarath, in the spheres of education, public utilities, and the protection of our nation's children. So we'll now take questions.
We have some questions coming in. First of all, Ms. Haynes, you spoke about the children that have been found to have dropped out of the school system. What solution do you propose to bring these kids back into the school system?
In the first instance, we were not supposed to be in this situation at all. In the early stages, if we had looked at the 46,770 students that were not accessing the online system, we would have known who would have been in danger of not coming back into the school system. But now that we're here, and it has been, and I want to be very resolute, this has been the failure of the Ministry of Education. What we're looking at now is a bolstering of the student support services and a proper partnership between the Ministry of Social Development and Education. And so that with this data, if you know that 2,800 students, as the figure today given to us, have dropped out of the school system, the first thing you have to ask is why? And then you can propose the targeted solutions. So that's why I asked earlier for a disaggregated space for the data so that we can understand by school district what are the preventative measures. Is it that the students are unable to afford to get to school? Is it that there is no interest? Is it that the students have been too far left behind and parents have taken them out of the school system? Are these children now working to support families. And those are the questions you have to have answered so that you have a targeted approach. What I'm calling on the Ministry of Education to do is not pretend that there isn't a problem, not lump all 2,800 students under the same banner, and be clear and upfront with the public. I think as Barry went through his issues today, as well as in the Ministry of Education, one thing is clear. This government believes that they are not answerable to the public, that there is no reason for a government minister to answer questions posed by the public. And while we are members of parliament and we have a parliamentary responsibility, the government has a duty to be accountable to the people of Trinidad and Tobago. You are not a law unto yourself. And so when you ask what can be done, there are lots of things that can be done. But the first thing the ministry has to do is get to work. Find out why these children have dropped out of the system, and then we can propose targeted solutions.
With respect to school violence, you've written to the Minister of Education requesting a meeting to discuss potential solutions. Has there been any progress on that front?
No. I found that most of our, as Barry would know, most of our letters go unanswered, but it is important for the public record that persons can see the advocacy coming from their members of parliament. The school violence issue has been escalating to the point now that we have members of the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service, members of the Defence Force being placed in schools or having to go into schools to curb what is very serious levels of violence in the school system. Last year, we saw the beginning, 2023, and again, you see it across sectors, because Barry was able to itemize from for the past year how things have gotten worse while we continue to pretend there isn't a problem. The government created an interministerial committee last year to discuss and come up with solutions to the issues of school violence. That committee has yet to report. I'm sure they are meeting. I really cannot tell you what they are discussing. The issues are very much in our faces. I don't know why they are coming into an interministerial committee and not meeting with stakeholders in the education sector and bringing to the table your PTA, your principals, the tutor, and the TTPS, and looking at the curriculum. I mean, I have raised this time and time again. You have students in school from 8 to 2:30, 8 to 3 p.m. Look at the curriculum. Introduce things like conflict resolution, anger management. Put it as part of the curriculum so that you can treat with the causes of violence within the school system. And if you did that, then you can tell us, all right, we can measure. We can say what is working well. But don't tell us you have another interministerial committee and then we're waiting another year for nothing, for another report, while the violence continues, while the violence escalates. And that's what we've been facing. I'm sure they're going to come up with another committee on school dropouts, and that will tell us nothing. They'll come up with another committee on exam results, which will lead us to nothing. And what we'll have are committees upon committees and no work being done by any of these very highly paid ministers.
And Padarath, as you mentioned, the delay in this solar panel project is going to cost taxpayers about $1 billion. How much of this $1 billion would have helped to take care of TNT's debt or the debt by state companies?
As you know, many of our state companies are running at a loss, and it's really a management issue in terms of the leadership coming from the government. With respect to this $1 billion, we must also ask, and I think the burning question is, where will the $1 billion come from? And that is really putting that issue on the front burner with respect to the questions that I've asked of the RIC. Because as part of the RIC's mandate and the RIC's act, they are allowed to review the documentation, the agreements, the terms and conditions of projects and so on that are signed on by TNTech and the government in analyzing the rate review. And therefore, this morning, the RIC should have been busy at work contacting the government and TNTech, finding out what are the terms and conditions of this LARA project. because it would mean essentially that the $1 billion will have to come from the taxpayer. And if TNTech is paying more, from 4.2 US cents to 6.7 US cents per kilowatt for electricity, TNTech then needs to find the money to pay for it. And RIC cannot assist the government in picking the pockets of citizens for their incompetence. And that is the bottom line. So while the $1 billion would help TNTech and others and other state companies to alleviate some of the debt, what it now does is that TNTech, that is already in a black hole, a sinkhole, is further indebted by another $1 billion. So we are told that TNTech has a debt to NGC for the arrangements of the production of electricity through the supply of natural gas by about $6 to $7 billion. We are told that TNTech has outstanding receivables from state agencies and so on in the tune of about $1.2 billion. So you are now adding, the government has now compounded the debt of TNTech with this project. But while the debt of TNTech is now continuing to climb because of the incompetence of the government in terms of the delay of the project and the renegotiating of the pricing arrangements between BP, Shell, and the government, what you now have happening is a worrying and troubling situation where the RIC is doing this rate review, and now additional monies need to be found to take TNTech out of the black hole, because in reviewing the rates, the RIC would have looked at what is the current debt management portfolio of TNTech. With this project costing taxpayers a further $1 billion, the RIC has to say whether or not they have considered this additional $1 billion, because TNTech will have to pay BP and Shell for the production of this electricity. It is not free. So TNTech has an additional $1 billion in its debt portfolio, taking it up probably something to $9-10 billion. But the RIC must answer whether or not they have considered the delay and failure to put this project into effect and the repercussions it will have on the cost in terms of the operations of TNTech and the ability to pay. So the RIC must say that, and I'm calling on the RIC, if they have not questioned those things as yet, that the RIC must ask. I said earlier, when BP and Shell told the Express that they have, because of the pricing arrangements, they cannot divulge. We have seen a history where there's Ministry of Sport, Ministry of the Attorney General, of the government hiding behind non-disclosure agreements. And what essentially that they've been hiding behind these non-disclosure agreements are things like scandalous payments, projects that they don't follow through on, missing files, the incompetence of attorney generals, not one but two. And that really is where the RIC should place their focus this morning, by getting a copy and requesting a copy of the terms and conditions, because they must know this morning that the debt of TNTech is set to increase by a further $1 billion, and that the taxpayer will be required to pay that.
You mentioned that it's been a year since the Justice Judith Jones report unearthed widespread abuse in children's homes. Since then, no one has been held accountable so far. Are you concerned that this delay in getting homes licensed means that children are still being abused in these homes across the country?
It is a very serious concern of ours, and it is one of the reasons that we continue to speak out on this particular matter of the licensing of children's homes. Both inside and outside of the parliament, we have been raising it by multiple members. I know Mrs. Prasad Bisesa herself, as a leader of the opposition, has raised this issue, and yes, it is a concern of ours, a very serious concern, because as it stands right now, 13 of these homes are operating illegally in contravention of the law. A lot of what I raised earlier, separated apart from the physical arrangements, the minister has been unable to tell us whether or not there is a safety and security mechanism that has been put in place to evaluate the level of security in terms of the physical arrangements. One, the persons who work in those homes, the persons who visit the homes, the persons who are employed in terms of the Children's Authority who will do the psychometric evaluation and psychological thinking. This is a minister who is not new to the portfolio. This minister has not changed portfolios in the last almost 8 years. And this information should have been at the fingertips of the minister to share with the population. We heard none of those things. And therefore, it brings us no comfort that a lot of what we saw coming out of the Justice Judy Rhodes report last year has been addressed or is not still occurring at these children's homes. So the minister has more questions than answers, but I think for the past 8 years, while there are elements that continue to prop this minister, and I will make no apologies for saying that, because what was the end result? The end result was that while the minister was crying these crocodile tears and telling you this is happening, it's coming, 8 years later, none of it has happened and none of it has come. There are even homes in this country that when the Justice Judith Jones report was announced on one of the recommendations was coming out to license the homes, and they announced the March 31st deadline for the license. Anita, do you know that there are some of the homes that when the announcement was made that they had to become licensed on March 31st, from March 2022 to today, absolutely no work, none has been done at some of the homes? None. And therefore, for the permanent secretary to come out and say, well, persons have died and abusers are no longer there. The permanent secretary, respectfully, is not the minister. The permanent secretary, respectfully, is not the commissioner of police. And those two persons and those two offices, they need to allay the fears of the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago that persons have been removed. And that is why I asked the question that I have asked. How many persons have been removed? How many persons have died? How many charges have been laid? How many investigations are still ongoing? How many investigations have been closed? And therefore, if the minister, coming with a team of technocrats to speak to the population, realize that the TTPS has not put out that information, the minister's responsibility, part of her responsibility, was to get the data from the TTPS to share with the national community, or invite the TTPS to that same press conference to answer those questions and make the TTPS and the ministry accountable and answerable to the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago, because it's the welfare of our nation's children that is at stake. So yes, we are very much concerned that a lot of this is still ongoing and the government is hiding and masking their incompetence, but that incompetence is resulting in the continued abuse of our nation's children.
There's one question. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much for joining us. As we began this morning's press conference, MP Barry Padarath would have indicated that we are in fact celebrating Holy Week in the Christian community, today being Holy Thursday. I would take this opportunity on behalf of the opposition, the United National Congress, to wish those of us who are celebrating this very joyous Easter occasion. But in the midst of this, we are in a very somber part of our Holy Week. It is indeed a very reflective space for the Christian community as we go through the sorrowful mysteries, the Passion of Christ. And I, as on behalf of the United National Congress,
Please take your picture.
Yes. And as we continue over the Easter weekend, I urge everyone to be safe, so that we look after our children during the Easter activities. I know it is a very active weekend. It is a prayerful weekend, and we wish everyone in Trinidad and Tobago a safe and holy Easter on behalf of the United National Congress. Thank you very much.